In the peaceful suburban town of Willowbrook, life moved at a steady, predictable pace. Neighbors exchanged polite greetings, children played in manicured yards, and the sound of lawnmowers was as familiar as the morning birdsong. Among the residents, Lena Whitman was a figure of admiration and envy. With her perfectly styled blonde hair, elegant wardrobe, and immaculate home, she seemed to embody the ideal of suburban perfection. Married to Peter Whitman, a successful corporate lawyer, and mother to 2 teenage daughters, Lena's life appeared to be everything she had ever wanted. But beneath the surface, Lena was suffocating. The daily routine that once brought her comfort had become a prison. Peter, though a good provider, was distant and consumed by his work. Their conversations had dwindled to mundane exchanges about the girls' schedules or the upcoming neighborhood events. The passion that once burned between them had long since faded, replaced by a cold, comfortable companionship that left Lena feeling more alone than she had ever imagined. It was during this time of quiet desperation that Mark entered her life. He was the new delivery man for the local grocery service, a job he had taken after moving to Willowbrook from the nearby city. Tall and ruggedly handsome, with a warm smile that reached his eyes, Mark was a stark contrast to the polished, buttoned-up men Lena was used to. His arrival each week with the groceries became a small highlight in Lena's otherwise monotonous days. At first, their interactions were nothing more than casual exchanges, a friendly greeting, a polite thank you, as he handed her the bags. But over time, these brief moments began to stretch into longer conversations. Lena found herself lingering at the door, asking about his day, sharing small details about her own. Mark, for his part, was always kind and attentive, listening with genuine interest as Lena spoke about her life. He would comment on the weather, ask about her daughters, or share a funny story from one of his other deliveries. These moments, though innocent, filled a void that had grown within Lena, and she began to look forward to his visits, with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. As the weeks passed, the connection between Lena and Mark deepened. What had begun as simple conversations soon became something more. They started to share personal stories. Lena spoke of her childhood dreams, her love for painting, and how those dreams had been set aside after marriage. Mark, in turn, talked about his struggles, how he had left the city to escape a past filled with poor decisions and heartbreak. He had taken the delivery job as a way to start fresh, seeking peace in the quiet routine of Willowbrook. Their conversations took on a new tone, more intimate and revealing. Lena found herself confiding in Mark in ways she hadn't with anyone in years. She spoke of her loneliness, the emotional distance between her and Peter, and the emptiness that had settled in her heart. Mark listened with a sympathetic ear, his own experiences allowing him to understand her pain more deeply than anyone else could. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Lena had been feeling particularly low that day, the weight of her unfulfilled life pressing down on her more than usual. When Mark arrived with the groceries, she invited him inside, using the rain as an excuse. They sat at the kitchen table, the sound of raindrops tapping against the window as they talked. The conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly, until suddenly, without either of them realizing how it happened, the atmosphere shifted. Lena noticed the way Mark's gaze lingered on her, how his voice softened when he spoke to her. Her heart raced as she realized that the feelings she had been trying to ignore were mutual. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, truly desired. The moment was charged with an unspoken tension, both of them knowing that they were crossing a line but unable to stop themselves. Mark reached out, his hand covering hers on the table. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through Lena's body. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and in that instant, everything changed. The boundaries of their relationship, once clear and defined, dissolved in the space between them. Without a word, they both understood what was happening. The forbidden had become irresistible, and there was no going back. The rain continued to fall as they leaned toward each other, the space between them closing until there was none left. When their lips met, it was as if a dam had broken, releasing all the emotions that had been building for weeks. The kiss was tender at first, tentative, but quickly became more urgent, fueled by the pent-up longing they both felt. It was a kiss that held within it all the desires, fears, and regrets that had brought them to this moment. In that single breathless moment, Lena felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The guilt was there, hovering at the edges of her mind, but it was drowned out by the intensity of the connection she felt with Mark. They broke apart, breathless and dazed, the reality of what they had just done sinking in. But instead of pulling away, they found themselves drawn even closer, the forbidden nature of their relationship only intensifying the desire they felt. The days following that fateful kiss were a whirlwind of emotions for Lena. She was filled with a confusing mix of guilt, excitement, and fear. On one hand, she knew what she was doing was wrong. She was betraying Peter, her marriage, and the life they had built together. But on the other hand, the connection she felt with Mark was undeniable. It was as if he had awakened something inside her that had been dormant for years, a spark of passion that she thought had long since died. Their affair began slowly, cautiously. Lena and Mark were both aware of the risks, the consequences that could follow if they were caught. They would meet in secret, finding moments when they could be alone without arousing suspicion. Lena became adept at crafting excuses to leave the house, errands, visits to friends, or spending time at her studio, which she had begun to use as a cover for their meetings. The secrecy only added to the intensity of their relationship. Every glance, every touch, was charged with the thrill of the forbidden. They would steal moments together in the back of Mark's delivery van, in secluded spots around town, or in the quiet corners of Lena's studio. Each encounter was filled with a sense of urgency, as if they were both aware that their time together could be cut short at any moment. But as the affair progressed, Lena began to struggle with the duality of her life. At home, she continued to play the role of the perfect wife and mother, attending to her daughters, managing the household, and supporting Peter in his work. She maintained the facade with a practiced ease, but inside, she was torn between her duty to her family and her desire for Mark. The more time she spent with Mark, the more she found herself pulling away from Peter. The distance between them grew, not just emotionally, but physically as well. Lena found it increasingly difficult to be around her husband, to pretend that everything was fine when she was living a lie. The guilt gnawed at her, but it was not enough to make her stop. The passion she felt with Mark was too strong, too consuming to walk away from. Mark, too, was conflicted. He had never intended to get involved with a married woman, but his feelings for Lena had taken him by surprise. He tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that what they were doing was wrong, but every time he saw her, all his resolve would crumble. He was drawn to her in a way that he couldn't explain, a way that made him willing to risk everything just to be with her. Peter Whitman was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people. In his line of work, he had developed a keen sense of when something wasn't right, and lately he had noticed a change in Lena. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in her mood, a distracted look in her eyes, an unexplained absence here and there. But as the weeks went on, these small changes became more pronounced, and Peter's instincts told him that something was wrong. He began to pay closer attention, watching Lena more carefully. He noticed how she seemed distant, how she would sometimes avoid his touch, or look away when he tried to talk to her. She was spending more time out of the house, often with vague explanations that didn't quite add up. Peter couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from him, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. At first, he tried to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia. Lena had always been a devoted wife, and he had never had reason to doubt her. But the more he observed, the more he began to worry that there was something deeper going on. He began to question her more about her activities, asking where she was going and who she was spending time with. Lena, sensing his growing suspicion, became more careful, but the strain of maintaining her double life was beginning to show. The tension between them grew, and their once peaceful home became a battleground of unspoken accusations and silent resentment. Peter, unable to shake his doubts, started to investigate on his own. He began to check Lena's phone, looking for any signs of infidelity, but found nothing. Frustrated, he started asking around discreetly, trying to gather information without raising alarm. His mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Meanwhile, Lena felt the walls closing in on her. She knew that Peter was becoming suspicious, and it terrified her. She tried to reassure him, to act as if everything was normal. But the guilt and fear were overwhelming. The affair with Mark, which had once brought her joy and excitement, was now a source of constant anxiety. The once secret thrill was now tinged with the looming threat of discovery. Despite the growing tension, Lena couldn't bring herself to end the affair. The connection she had with Mark was too powerful, too vital to give up. But as Peter's suspicions deepened, she knew that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The moment of reckoning came sooner than either of them expected. It was a warm summer afternoon, and Lena had arranged to meet Mark at her studio, a place that had become their sanctuary. She had made sure that Peter would be at work all day, believing that they were safe. But as fate would have it, Peter had decided to come home early again, driven by a nagging suspicion that he could no longer ignore. Peter's arrival was quiet and unannounced. He parked a few blocks away from the house, intending to surprise Lena and perhaps catch a glimpse of whatever it was that had been occupying her time. As he approached the studio, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, a part of him hoping that he was wrong, that there was some innocent explanation for everything. But the sight of Mark's familiar van parked nearby told him otherwise. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The studio was quiet, but the sound of hushed voices came from the back room. Peter moved closer, his worst fears materializing with every step. When he reached the doorway, what he saw confirmed everything he had been dreading. Lena and Mark were standing close together, their bodies almost touching, their voices low and intimate. It was clear that this was more than just a friendly conversation. The betrayal was written in every gesture, every glance they exchanged. Peter felt a rush of anger and disbelief, the image of his wife with another man searing into his mind. Unable to contain himself, Peter stepped into the room. Lena and Mark turned at the sound of his footsteps, their faces draining of color as they saw him standing there. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. Peter's gaze shifted between them, the realization of what had been happening crashing over him like a wave. Lena tried to speak, to offer some explanation, but the words caught in her throat. Mark, equally frozen, could only stare in shock. The reality of their situation hit them all at once. There was no hiding now, no more lies to tell. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the consequences. Peter stood motionless, his eyes locked on Lena, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him like a crushing force. His mind raced, trying to process the scene in front of him, the woman he had loved and trusted, standing so intimately close to another man. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it quickly morphed into a seething anger, a rage that he could barely contain. Lena, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, took a hesitant step toward Peter. "Peter, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling, but the words sounded hollow, even to her. How could she possibly explain the unexplainable? She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now she was facing the devastating consequences. "Explain?" Peter's voice was low, dangerously controlled. "Explain what, Lena? That you've been lying to me? That you've been sneaking around with him behind my back?" He gestured toward Mark, who stood rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak. Mark finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Peter, I never meant for this to happen. It just—" But Peter cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Never meant for this to happen? You think that makes it better?" Peter's voice rose, the anger he had been holding back now spilling over. "You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family. All for what? A few stolen moments?" Lena flinched at the harshness in Peter's words. "It wasn't like that," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. But she knew that no matter what she said, there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. Peter's fury, once directed outward at Mark, now turned inward, seething through every fiber of his being. The life he had built, the trust he had placed in Lena, had all been shattered in an instant. He felt betrayed, not just by Lena, but by the very foundation of their relationship. Mark, sensing the escalating tension, tried to diffuse the situation. "Peter, maybe we should all just calm down and talk this through. No one wanted this to happen." But Peter was beyond reasoning. The anger had taken hold, and all he could think about was the betrayal, the lies. "Talk this through. There's nothing to talk about. You've ruined everything." He stepped closer to Mark, his fists clenched, his face contorted with rage. Lena, desperate to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control, stepped between them. "Peter, please, just listen to me. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." But it was too late. The words did nothing to soothe Peter's anger. Instead, they only served to remind him of the pain and betrayal. In a moment of blind fury, he shoved Lena aside, turning his full attention to Mark. You're the reason for all of this." Peter's voice was a mix of pain and rage as he lunged at Mark, fists flying. Mark barely had time to react. He tried to defend himself, raising his arms to block Peter's punches, but Peter's anger was too fierce. The two men struggled, their movements frantic and chaotic, as Lena screamed for them to stop. But the noise, the desperation, only fueled the violence. In the midst of the struggle, Mark's hand found a heavy vase on the table beside him. In a panic, without thinking, he grabbed it and swung. The vase connected with Peter's head with a sickening thud. Peter staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to the floor. Lena's scream pierced the air, a sound of pure horror, as she rushed to Peter's side. Blood pooled around his head, staining the floor as Lena frantically tried to rouse him. Peter, please," she cried, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. Mark stood frozen, the vase still in his hand, his mind reeling from what he had just done. The room was eerily quiet now. The only sound, the ragged breaths of Lena as she sobbed over Peter's motionless body. The realization of what had just happened began to sink in for both of them. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Lena knelt beside Peter, her hands covered in his blood, her mind unable to comprehend the horror of what had just occurred. Mark, still holding the vase, dropped it with a clatter, his face ashen and eyes wide with disbelief. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Lena's soft, desperate pleas for Peter to wake up. But Peter didn't move. The life that had once filled him, the anger, the love, the pain, it was all gone, leaving behind only a lifeless shell. Lena's sobs grew louder as the reality of the situation hit her with full force. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, was gone. And it was her fault. She had brought this upon them all, and there was no going back. Mark, too, was paralyzed by the enormity of what had happened. He had never meant for things to go this far. The affair had been a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but he had never imagined it would end like this. The blood on the floor, the still body of Peter. It was all too much to process. "We need to call someone," Mark finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The police. An ambulance." "No!" Lena's voice was sharp, panicked. She looked up at Mark, her eyes wild with fear. "We can't. They'll take us away. Her words faltered as the full implications of what had just happened hit her. Mark understood the fear in Lena's eyes, the same fear that was beginning to grip him. If the police came, they would be arrested. They would be separated, tried, and convicted. Their lives would be over, all because of a moment of passion that had spiraled out of control. Lena's mind raced, searching for a way out, for something, anything, that could undo the horror of the last few minutes. But there was no undoing it. The blood was real, the body was real, and now they had to face the consequences. "Help me," Lena finally said, her voice trembling. "We have to clean this up. We can't let anyone find out." Mark hesitated, but the fear of what might happen if they were caught was overwhelming. Numbly he nodded, and together they began the grim task of trying to erase the evidence of what had happened. They worked in silence, their movements mechanical, driven by pure survival instinct. They wrapped Peter's body in a sheet, the process slow and agonizing, as they struggled with the weight of the man they had both betrayed. Every step was filled with dread, the realization that they were crossing yet another line they could never return from. When they finally carried Peter's body to Mark's van, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the driveway. They moved quickly, driven by the fear of being seen, the fear of the consequences if they were caught. The weight of the body was nothing compared to the weight of their guilt, which threatened to crush them both with every step they took. As they drove to a remote location outside of town, the silence between them was suffocating. There were no words to describe the horror of what they were doing. No way to make sense of the nightmare that their lives had become. All they could do was continue moving forward, driven by the desperate hope that they could somehow escape the consequences of their actions. But deep down, both Lena and Mark knew that there was no escaping this. They had crossed too many lines, made too many mistakes. And as they disposed of Peter's body, burying him in a shallow grave in the woods, they both knew that their lives would never be the same again. The night was dark and cold, the sounds of the forest surrounding them as they finished their task. When it was done, they stood in silence, looking down at the freshly turned earth that now held the body of the man they had once loved and betrayed. The weight of their actions hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the irreversible path they had chosen. As they drove back to town, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The only thing that remained was the knowledge that their lives were now bound together by the terrible secret they shared, a secret that would haunt them for the rest of their days. The days following Peter's disappearance were a blur for Lena and Mark. They returned to their separate lives, trying desperately to maintain an air of normalcy despite the horror that now consumed them. Lena especially was on edge, her every action carefully measured, her every word meticulously planned. She told herself that if she could just keep everything together, if she could act as though nothing had happened, then maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. But it was not to be. Peter's absence was immediately noticed. He was a man of routine, and when he failed to show up for a crucial meeting at work, alarm bells began to ring. His colleagues, accustomed to his punctuality and professionalism, grew concerned. They called his phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. By the following day, worry had turned to panic, and Peter's boss contacted the police. Detective Laura Mitchell was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for her sharp instincts, Mitchell quickly realized that this was no ordinary missing person case. Peter's disappearance was out of character, and the circumstances surrounding it were suspicious. When she spoke to Peter's colleagues and friends, they all said the same thing. Peter was reliable, diligent, and not the type of man to simply vanish. Mitchell began her investigation by visiting the Whitman home. Lena had prepared herself for this moment, rehearsing her responses in her mind. She answered the door with a calm demeanor, the picture of a worried wife. "Detective Mitchell," she greeted, her voice steady despite the storm of fear brewing inside her. "Please come in. I've been so worried about Peter. I don't know where he could be." Mitchell took in the scene with a practiced eye. The house was immaculate, the kind of perfection that comes from years of maintaining a flawless image. But there was something off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She studied Lena carefully, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted away when she spoke. "Mrs. Whitman," Mitchell began, her tone professional but probing, "can you tell me when you last saw your husband?" Lena had prepared for this. "It was 2 days ago," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "He left for work in the morning, as usual. He had a big meeting that day, but he never came home. I thought maybe he was staying late at the office. But when he didn't come back, I started to worry." Mitchell nodded, making notes in her small notebook. "And there was no contact from him? No messages? No calls?" "No," Lena replied, shaking her head. "I tried calling him several times, but his phone went straight to voicemail." Mitchell continued her questioning, moving through the usual checklist. "Did Peter have any enemies? Had he been acting strangely lately? Was there any reason to believe he might have left voluntarily?" Lena answered each question with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed her lines, but Mitchell could sense the underlying tension. As the interview went on, Mitchell's instincts told her that something was wrong. There were too many inconsistencies, too many small details that didn't add up. When she asked about the last time Lena had been in Peter's office, Lena hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Mitchell to notice. "You mentioned that Peter had been working late recently," Mitchell said, her tone casual. "Was there anything unusual about his behavior in the days leading up to his disappearance?" Lena shook her head quickly. "No, nothing unusual. He was just busy, I suppose. We didn't talk much those last few days. He was very focused on work." Mitchell made a note of this, but she wasn't convinced. As she wrapped up the interview, she asked to take a look around the house. Lena, having anticipated this request, agreed without hesitation, leading Mitchell on a tour of the home. As they moved through the rooms, Mitchell took in every detail. The house was pristine, almost too pristine. It was the kind of cleanliness that suggested someone had gone to great lengths to remove any trace of wrongdoing. But despite Lena's best efforts, there were small signs that all was not as it seemed. A faint smell of bleach in the air, a slight discoloration in the carpet near the living room, and a few items that seemed out of place. After the tour, Mitchell thanked Lena and left the house, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. There was no direct evidence of foul play, but her gut told her that something was off. She decided to dig deeper into Peter's life, starting with his phone records and bank accounts. Meanwhile, Lena and Mark were living in a state of constant fear. Every ring of the phone, every knock on the door, sent waves of panic through them. They knew that the walls were closing in, that it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But they couldn't stop now. They had to keep up the charade, keep pretending that everything was normal, even as the noose tightened around them. As the investigation intensified, Mitchell uncovered more clues that pointed to foul play. Peter's phone records showed a pattern of calls to a number she didn't recognize, a number that belonged to Mark. She also discovered that Peter had withdrawn a large sum of money from his account just days before his disappearance, raising further suspicions. Mitchell began to piece together a timeline, connecting the dots between Peter's disappearance and Lena's interactions with Mark. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that Peter's disappearance was no accident. There was a story here, a dark, twisted story that she was determined to uncover. The investigation was heating up, and Mitchell knew she was getting close to the truth. But she also knew that whoever was responsible for Peter's disappearance would do anything to keep their secret buried. And as she prepared to make her next move, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something much darker than she had anticipated.